Welcome back to Vietnamese Vixens. Today's story is about a phrase that sounds harmless until you understand what it really means. It's about a man who thought being called special was a compliment, who wore a label with pride until he realized it was never about him at all. This is Eric's story. 38 years old, software consultant from Stockholm, Sweden. He came to Hanoi looking for color in a life that had gone gray, and he found it. Found warmth, found laughter, found a woman who made him feel seen for the first time in years. But the way she saw him, the words she used to describe him, those should have been his first warning. She called him Ông Tai Giàu. Rich foreigner. He thought it was affection. Thought it was playful. By the time he understood what it really meant, she'd already taken everything. Before we get into Eric's story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Have you ever been flattered by someone only to realize later they were sizing you up? Hit that like button if you've learned this lesson the hard way, and subscribe for more real stories about expats learning painful truths in Southeast Asia. Alright, here's Eric's story, in his own words. I landed in Hanoi on a January afternoon, and the first thing that hit me was how alive everything felt. I know that sounds stupid, but coming from Stockholm in the middle of winter, where the sun sets at 3 in the afternoon and everything is gray and dead and frozen, Vietnam felt like stepping into a different dimension. The heat, the noise, the absolute chaos of the traffic. Motorbikes everywhere, horns blaring, people shouting, the smell of cooking food mixing with exhaust fumes. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. I'd been divorced for 4 months. Well, separated for 4 months. The paperwork was still processing back in Sweden, but the marriage had been dead long before that. 12 years with Karen, and somewhere around year 7 we just stopped trying. Stopped talking about anything real. Stopped touching, except by accident. We built this perfectly functional life together in our apartment, in Basistan. 2 careers, no kids, dinner parties with other couples who probably weren't happy either. Everything looked fine from the outside. But I'd wake up every morning feeling like I was suffocating in my own life. When my company offered me a remote consulting contract, I didn't even hesitate. Told Karen I was leaving. She barely reacted. I think she was relieved. I sold most of my things, put the rest in storage, and bought a one-way ticket to Hanoi. My friends thought I was having a breakdown. My brother said I was being irresponsible. But sitting in that taxi from the airport into the city, watching the organized chaos blur past the window, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt possibility. I found an apartment in Tay Ho, the expat area, through a Facebook group. Nothing fancy, just a furnished 1-bedroom with air conditioning and decent internet. The landlord was an older Vietnamese woman who spoke some English and seemed amused by my terrible attempt at saying Chinka. The rent was cheap by Stockholm standards. I could actually live here, properly live, without the crushing weight of Swedish expenses and Swedish expectations. The first few weeks were about adjustment, learning to cross the street without getting killed, figuring out which street food was safe and which would destroy my stomach, finding a routine that worked with Swedish business hours. I'd wake up early, work from a cafe until lunch, then spend the afternoons exploring the city, the old quarter with its narrow streets and ancient temples, West Lake with its expat bars and international restaurants, the chaos of Dong Xuan Market, where I'd wander through stalls selling everything imaginable. But mostly I was lonely. I left Sweden to escape a dead marriage, but I'd also left behind everyone I knew. The expats I met in Tay Ho were friendly enough, mostly English teachers and consultants like me, but everyone seemed transient. Passing through. Nobody felt solid. I'd sit in bars listening to guys tell stories about their Vietnamese girlfriends, about the scams they'd avoided or fallen for, about the rules for dating here. It all felt cynical and exhausting. I wasn't looking for a relationship. Honestly, I wasn't. I just wanted to exist somewhere that felt alive, somewhere I could breathe without feeling like I was disappointing everyone around me just by existing. I met Hyung on a Wednesday evening in early March. There was a language exchange event at a cafe near Hoan Kiem Lake. One of those things where foreigners trying to learn Vietnamese pair up with locals trying to practice English. I'd been in Hanoi for about 6 weeks, and my Vietnamese was still embarrassingly bad. I could order coffee and say thank you, and that was about it. I figured it might be good to actually try learning the language properly instead of just pointing at things and hoping for the best. The cafe was crowded, mostly young Vietnamese people and a handful of foreigners. I grabbed a coffee and stood awkwardly near the entrance, not sure how these things worked. Then this woman walked up to me and said in English, "You look lost. First time here?" She had this easy smile, confident, like she was used to approaching strangers. Her English was good, slightly accented but clear. That was Huang, 29 years old, which she told me immediately, like she wanted to establish that she wasn't some kid. She was pretty in that effortless way some Vietnamese women have. Long dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, minimal makeup, wearing jeans and a simple white blouse. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed she was trying too hard. She worked in import-export, she said, for a company that dealt with textiles. Lived with a roommate in Hai Ba Trung district. Grew up in Haiphong, but moved to Hanoi for university and stayed. We sat down at a table and started the language exchange thing. She'd teach me a Vietnamese phrase. I'd teach her some Swedish. She laughed at my pronunciation, said I sounded like I was trying to swallow my tongue. I laughed at her attempt to say Jag kommer från Sverige, which came out so mangled I couldn't even correct it properly. It was easy, natural. The conversation flowed in a way conversations with Karen hadn't flowed in years. Then she noticed my watch. I was wearing a decent Omega, nothing crazy expensive but not cheap either. She pointed at it and said something in Vietnamese, then translated. Hong Tai Giàu. She smiled when she said it, almost teasing. I asked what it meant and she laughed. Rich foreigner. Westerner with money. You have nice watch, nice MacBook. Your own Tai Giàu. The way she said it felt playful, like a joke between friends. I laughed and said I wasn't rich, just had a decent job. She touched my arm lightly and said, in Vietnam, you are rich. That's okay. I'm just teasing you. The touch lingered for a second longer than necessary. I felt something shift in my chest, something warm and unexpected. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about Sweden, about why I'd come to Vietnam, about my work. I asked about her life, her family, her job. She told me her father had gambling problems when she was young, that money was always tight growing up, that she'd worked hard to get where she was now. There was something genuine in the way she talked about it. No self-pity, just matter-of-fact about the difficulties she'd faced. I found myself wanting to know more, wanting to hear her stories, wanting to make her laugh again. When the event ended and people started leaving, she asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime. Said she knew all the best local places, the spots tourists never found. I said yes immediately, maybe too immediately. She smiled and pulled out her phone, and we exchanged numbers. As I walked back to my apartment that night through the warm Hanoi evening, I kept replaying the phrase in my head in Ing Tar Gigio, rich foreigner. The way she'd said it with that smile, that little laugh, it felt like a compliment, like she was noticing me, seeing me as someone successful, someone worth her time. We had dinner 3 days later at a small restaurant in the old quarter, the kind of place with plastic stools and fluorescent lights and absolutely incredible food. She ordered for both of us in Vietnamese, explained what everything was, taught me how to eat it properly. Bun chu with herbs and dipping sauce. Spring rolls. I had to wrap myself. She laughed every time I made a mess, but not in the mean way. In a way that made me feel comfortable being incompetent, comfortable being myself. She asked about my marriage. I'd mentioned being recently separated, and she wanted details. I told her about Karen, about the slow death of something that had probably never been that alive to begin with. About waking up one day and realizing we were just roommates who occasionally had awkward sex. About the relief I felt when she asked for the divorce. Hishong listened intently, asked questions, said it sounded lonely. Said she'd been in a relationship like that too, with a Vietnamese guy who wanted her to be something she wasn't. When the bill came, she reached for it immediately. Said she'd invited me, she should pay. I protested, and we compromised, splitting it down the middle. That felt important somehow. Proof that she wasn't after my money, that this was real, that she liked me for me. As we walked to where she'd parked her motorbike, she called me Ong Tai Jia again, but this time with a little smile, like it was our inside joke. Eng Trago needs to learn to eat with chopsticks better, she said, nudging my shoulder. The next few weeks blurred together in the best way. We saw each other 3 or 4 times a week. She'd text me good morning in Vietnamese, trying to teach me new words. We'd meet for coffee or dinner or just walk around the lake talking about everything and nothing. She took me to places I never would have found on my own. A tiny alley with the best view in Hanoi, served by an old woman who'd been making it the same way for 40 years. A Buddhist temple in the north part of the city where we sat in silence, watching incense smoke curl toward the ceiling. A rooftop bar with a view of the whole city spread out below us like something from a movie. She kept calling me Ong Tai Jiao. Sometimes when I'd pay for dinner, even though she protested. Sometimes when we'd pass expensive shops and she'd point at things and say, That's for Ong Tai Gio like you. Sometimes when her friends would meet us, and she'd introduce me, always with that phrase, always with a smile. They'd laugh, say something in Vietnamese I couldn't understand, and she'd wave them off. I asked her once if it bothered her dating a foreigner. She looked at me seriously and said, "Why would it bother me? You're kind. You're interesting. And you're Ong Tae Gio, which doesn't hurt." She laughed after she said it, squeezed my hand. I laughed too. But something small shifted in my chest, something I didn't want to examine too closely. Was she joking? Was there truth under the joke? I pushed the thought away. She was affectionate, attentive, made me feel wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. The phrase was just teasing. Just her way of acknowledging the obvious differences between us. Nothing to worry about. By the end of April, we'd been seeing each other for about 6 weeks, and I was falling hard. Harder than I'd fallen for Karen, harder than I'd fallen for anyone. Chung made me feel alive, made me feel like life still had surprises and joy and possibility. When I was with her, I didn't think about the divorce or the wasted years in Stockholm or the crushing mediocrity of my old life. I just felt present, grateful, lucky. She started staying over at my apartment. Not every night, but a few times a week. We'd cook dinner together, or order in, watch movies with Vietnamese subtitles that she'd translate for me. She'd fall asleep on my couch with her head on my shoulder, and I'd sit there afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. In the morning, she'd make Vietnamese coffee in my kitchen, strong and sweet, and we'd sit on my tiny balcony watching the city wake up. I still hadn't been to her place. Every time I suggested it, she'd have a reason. Her roommate was difficult, very private, didn't like visitors. Her apartment was small and embarrassing compared to mine. The neighborhood wasn't nice, she didn't want me to see it. All of it sounded reasonable. Vietnam was different from Sweden. Privacy meant different things here. I didn't want to push, didn't want to make her uncomfortable. But late at night, after she'd gone home, I'd lie awake in my bed and replay things in my head. The way she'd said "Ong Tai Ja" when showing me off to her friends. The way she'd mentioned my salary once, casually, like she'd been calculating something. The way she'd never split a bill after that first dinner, always letting me pay, always with a smile and a "thank you, Ong Tae Ja." I told myself I was being paranoid, bringing baggage from my marriage where Karen had made me feel inadequate and unwanted. Dodging was different. She was warm, affectionate, genuine. The phrase was just playful. Just her way of acknowledging that, yes, by Vietnamese standards, I had money. That didn't mean she was with me for the money. It just meant she wasn't going to pretend we came from the same world. But the phrase had started to feel different. Less like a joke, more like a label. Less like affection, more like a category I'd been placed in. I was Ong Tai Giàu, rich foreigner. And every time she said it, smiling that beautiful smile, I felt a small knot form in my stomach that I refused to acknowledge. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting that maybe my Swedish friends were right when they'd warned me about dating here. Would mean admitting that maybe I was being played. Would mean going back to that crushing loneliness, that sense of being invisible in my own life. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Not when Hung made me feel so seen, so wanted, so alive. So I pushed the doubts away. Told myself the phrase meant nothing. Told myself I was overthinking. Told myself that love required trust, and trust meant giving people the benefit of the doubt. And I believed it. Or I wanted to believe it so badly that it amounted to the same thing. 3 months in, and I'd stopped noticing the heat. That thick, wet Hanoi humidity that had felt so oppressive when I first arrived now just felt normal. I'd adapted, learned to move slower, dress lighter, except that I'd always be slightly sweaty between May and September. I'd adapted to a lot of things, actually. The constant noise, the organized chaos of traffic, the way time worked differently here, more fluid, less rigid than Swedish punctuality. And I'd adapted to Shung calling me Ong Tae Giàu, like it was my actual name. She was staying over most nights now. Her toothbrush lived in my bathroom. Half my closet had her clothes in it. She'd come over after work, we'd cook dinner or order in, spend the evening together like we were already living together. It felt domestic, comfortable, real. I'd catch myself imagining a future where this was permanent, where maybe we'd get a bigger place together, where maybe eventually I'd bring her back to Sweden to meet my family. But I still hadn't been to her apartment. 4 months of dating, and I'd never seen where she actually lived. The excuses had evolved, become more elaborate. Her roommate's mother was staying with them. They were having work done on the plumbing. Her roommate's boyfriend basically lived there. and was crowded and uncomfortable. Each explanation sounded reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern I was trying very hard not to see. The phrase had changed to.ing. Tai Jiao wasn't just playful teasing anymore. It had weight now. Context. She'd say it when talking about problems, always with this implicit expectation. The landlord raised my rent again, but your own Tai Jiao, you don't have to worry about these things. My motorbike needs new tires, but for own Tai Jiu, that's nothing, right? She'd smile when she said it, touch my arm, make it feel light, but underneath was something harder, an assumption. A category I'd been placed in that came with certain responsibilities. The first real request came on a Tuesday evening in late May. We were having dinner at my apartment, some pasta dish I'd attempted that came out mediocre, but she'd eaten anyway, praising my cooking in that way that made it clear she was being kind. Her phone buzzed, and she checked it, and her face fell. Just this sudden shift from happy to worried that made my chest tighten with concern. I asked what was wrong. She hesitated, like she didn't want to burden me. Then she said her motorbike had broken down that afternoon. The engine was making terrible sounds. The mechanic said it needed serious work. She'd gotten a quote, 8 million dong. She said the number in Vietnamese first, then translated it to dollars for me. About 320. She wasn't asking directly, just mentioning it, letting it hang in the air between us. But I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she watched my reaction. I offered immediately. Said of course I'd help. What kind of boyfriend would I be if I let her struggle with something I could easily afford? She protested, but not very hard. Said she couldn't accept it, but her eyes were already saying yes. When I transferred the money to her account that night, she kissed me deeply, called me her generous Ong Tai Jiao, told me I was different from other foreign men she'd known, that I understood how to treat a woman properly. I felt good, felt needed, useful, masculine, in a way my marriage had never made me feel. Karen had always been financially independent, had always made it clear she didn't need anything from me. But Hing needed me, and that need felt like love. 2 weeks later, her mother needed dental surgery. Hing mentioned it over coffee, this worry creeping into her voice. Said her mother had been in pain for months, couldn't afford proper treatment. The family was trying to save up, but it would take too long. 15 million dong, about $600. She showed me a photo of her mother, this tired-looking woman in her 50s, and said she felt helpless not being able to help her own family. I gave her the money that same day. Didn't even hesitate. She cried a little, said I was too good to her, that she didn't deserve someone so kind. We made love that night, and afterward, she held me tight and whispered, Ji ji sa, in Vietnamese, my rich foreigner. At the time, it felt possessive in a romantic way, like I belonged to her. Looking back now, I can hear the actual possessiveness, the ownership. The requests started coming more frequently after that. Her brother needed money for a business opportunity. Her niece's school fees were due. She had credit card debt from a previous business venture that had failed, and the interest was killing her. Each amount was significant, but not devastating. 300 here, 500 there. Never enough that I felt like I had to say no, but always enough that my savings account was getting noticeably thinner. And always, she'd frame it with that phrase. I know you're Ong Tai Jiu, so this isn't a lot for you. Can Ong Tai Jiu help me one more time? Sometimes she'd say it sweetly, affectionately. Other times there was an edge to it. An implication that this was my role, my function. That being Ong Tai Jiu came with obligations. My Swedish friends in Hanoi started making pointed comments. We'd meet for beers at one of the expat bars in Tay Ho, and they'd ask careful questions. How much had I given her? Did I know what Ong Tai Jiu actually meant? Did I understand the connotations? One guy, Lars, who'd been in Vietnam for 5 years, pulled me aside one night and said, Man, that phrase isn't what you think it is. It's not affectionate. It's categorizing you. You're not a person to her, you're a type. I got defensive. Told him he was being cynical, that he didn't know Hung, didn't understand our relationship. He just shook his head and said, Every guy says that. Every single one. Then 6 months later, they're telling the same story at this bar, wondering how they missed all the signs. But I wasn't like those other guys. Hing wasn't like those other girls. We had something real. She cared about me. The money was just temporary help while her family was struggling. Once things stabilized, we'd be fine. We'd move forward. Maybe I'd take her to Sweden next year, introduce her to my family, show her Stockholm in the summer when the city was actually beautiful. I held on to that fantasy even as the evidence mounted, even as she started saying "Ong Tai Ji" differently. In front of shopkeepers, when we'd go shopping together, she'd gesture at me and say something in Vietnamese that always made them smile and give her better prices. She was using my foreignness, my perceived wealth, as a negotiating tool. When her friends came to dinner, she'd introduce me the same way every time. "This is Eric, my boyfriend, Ong Tai Jiu." They'd laugh, say things in Vietnamese I couldn't understand, and she'd wave them off, but with this knowing smile. I started to notice how she'd position me. We'd be at a restaurant, and she'd mention loudly, in Vietnamese, that I was paying. The staff would suddenly become more attentive. We'd be shopping, and she'd switch to English when she wanted me to hear something, Vietnamese when she didn't. I'd catch fragments: money, foreign, rich. I started feeling less like a boyfriend and more like an accessory, a status symbol, a wallet with emotions attached. By August, 4 months into the relationship, I'd given her roughly 80 million dong, about $3,200. My savings account was looking concerning. Not empty, but concerning. I'd started working extra hours, taking on additional projects to compensate. When my Swedish friends asked how much I'd spent on her, I'd downplay it. Say it wasn't that much. Say she needed help. Say this is just how relationships work in Vietnam. But privately, alone in my apartment when she wasn't there, I'd sit with my laptop open, looking at my bank statements, and feel something cold settle in my stomach. The numbers didn't lie, and the pattern was clear if I was willing to see it. Every request was carefully calibrated. Never so much I'd refuse, but always enough to keep me invested. And always framed with that phrase, "Dotting G Jiu," rich foreigner. Like it explained everything. Like it justified everything. She started mentioning other men. Casually, in passing, but with purpose. Her friend's boyfriend, who was Australian, worked in finance, just bought her friend's family a house. Her coworker's boyfriend, who was American, took her coworker on expensive vacations. Her cousin's husband, who was British, owned multiple businesses. Always comparing. Always measuring. Never saying directly that I was lacking, but the implication hung heavy in every story. "You're lucky I'm not materialistic," she said once, laughing, after telling me about her friend's new motorcycle, a gift from her foreign boyfriend. "I don't need expensive things. I just need someone who cares about me." She touched my face when she said it, gentle, affectionate. But her eyes were calculating, watching to see if I'd take the bait, if I'd offer to buy her something to prove I cared as much as those other foreign men. I did. Bought her a new phone. 30 million dong, about $1,200, because she said hers was old and kept crashing. She kissed me and called me her wonderful Ong Tai Jiao, and I felt that same warm glow of being needed, being appreciated. But it faded faster this time. The glow. The good feeling. It faded within hours and left behind something sour. The disappearances got worse. She'd vanish for 2 or 3 days with increasingly implausible excuses. Family emergency in Haiphong. Her roommate needed help with something urgent, her cousin's wedding in Hue. She'd come back apologetic, affectionate, explaining everything in detail. But the details never quite added up. The timelines were fuzzy. The stories changed slightly each time she told them. I started checking her social media. I'm not proud of it, but I did. Her Facebook was mostly in Vietnamese, posts I couldn't read without translation apps. But the photos told stories. Her at expensive restaurants I'd never taken her to. Her with groups of people I'd never met. Her at a beach resort in Da Nang during one of her supposed family emergencies. When I asked about the photos, she'd have explanations. Old photos she was just posting now. Her friend's photos she was tagged in. The resort was actually near her aunt's house. She'd just stopped by for an hour. All of it was possible. All of it could have been true. But the feeling in my gut was getting harder to ignore. That sick, twisting feeling that something was very wrong. That I was being played. That "on tai jiao" wasn't a term of endearment, but a job description I'd been fulfilling while telling myself it was love. We fought for the first time in late September. She'd asked for money for her brother's medical bills. 20 million dong, about $800. I'd hesitated. Actually hesitated. My savings were looking genuinely concerning now, and my company had hinted at budget cuts coming. I told her I needed to think about it, that money was getting tight. Her face changed, hardened. She said, "But you're on Taijiju. How can money be tight for you?" There was no playfulness in it now, no teasing. Just accusation. like I was failing to live up to my designated role. I tried to explain. Told her about the potential contract cuts, about how I'd already given her a lot, about needing to be more careful. She got quiet. Then she said, slowly, carefully, "So you're saying you don't want to help my family anymore? You're saying money is more important than my brother's health?" It was manipulation, and I knew it. But knowing didn't stop the guilt from flooding through me. Didn't stop me from feeling like a terrible person, like I was being selfish and small. I gave her the money. Of course I did. And she smiled and kissed me and called me her generous own Tai Giàu, and everything felt okay again for about 30 seconds. But that night, after she'd gone home, I sat on my balcony and watched the Hanoi traffic and let myself think the thoughts I'd been avoiding for months. Let myself add up all the money. Let myself see the pattern. Let myself hear the phrase, "ông tai jiu," the way Lars had tried to explain it to me, not as affection, as categorization, as a label that reduced me to my perceived wealth and my foreignness. I'd wanted so badly to feel wanted that I'd accepted being needed as a substitute. I'd wanted so badly to feel seen that I'd accepted being categorized as close enough. I was ông tai jiu to her, rich foreigner. Not Eric, not a person with thoughts and feelings and complexity, just a type, a role, a function. And the worst part was 1/500 known. Some part of me had known from the very beginning, from that first language exchange when she'd looked at my watch and my laptop and named me. But I'd wanted to believe in something beautiful more than I'd wanted to believe in something true. So I'd let her call me ông cha jiu and told myself it was a compliment. Told myself it meant she saw me as successful, as capable, as someone worth her time. When really it just meant she'd identified what I could provide. And everything that came after was just the extraction process. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in early October. I was working from a cafe near my apartment, halfway through a video meeting with my team in Stockholm, when my boss asked me to stay on after everyone else dropped off. That's never a good sign. He explained it carefully, apologetically. Budget cuts across the whole company. My contract hours were being reduced by 40%. Still employed, still remote, but significantly less income starting next month. I sat in that cafe for an hour after the call ended, staring at my laptop screen, doing the math. 40% less meant my comfortable life in Hanoi would get tight. Not impossible, but tight. No more casual spending, no more safety net, and definitely no more giving away hundreds of dollars every few weeks. I told Xing that evening over dinner at a restaurant she'd chosen, one of the nicer places near the lake. I tried to be matter-of-fact about it. Said the company was cutting back, my income would drop, but I'd be fine. Just needed to be more careful with money for a while. I expected sympathy, maybe concern, maybe reassurance that we'd figure it out together. Instead, she went very still, put down her chopsticks, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then she asked, "How much will you still make?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What does this mean for you?" Just the number, the calculation, I told her, converting it from SEK to USD in my head. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, slowly, carefully, "So you're not really ông tai jiu anymore." The way she said it made my stomach drop. Clinical. Disappointed. Like I'd fundamentally changed categories. Like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. I tried to laugh it off. Said I was still the same person, still had a decent income, just needed to be more careful. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said she understood. But she barely touched her food after that. Left early. Said she had a headache. Kissed me on the cheek in a way that felt perfunctory. She didn't answer my texts the next day, or the day after that. I called and it went to voicemail. I told myself she was busy, that she needed space to process, that I was being paranoid. But that sick feeling in my gut was back, stronger now, impossible to ignore. When she finally responded 3 days later, her messages were different, shorter, less warm. She said she was stressed with work, dealing with family stuff, needed some time. We made plans for dinner that week, but she canceled last minute. Made plans again, and she showed up 30 minutes late, distracted, checking her phone constantly. I asked if everything was okay between us. She said, of course. Why would I ask that? She was just busy. But she wouldn't look at me when she said it, and she left after an hour, said she had to get up early the next day. Didn't stay over, didn't kiss me goodbye the way she used to. Just a quick peck, and then she was gone, her motorbike disappearing into Hanoi traffic. The comparisons started coming more frequently. She'd mention her friends' boyfriends, always foreign, always apparently wealthy. My friend's boyfriend just bought her family a house in Haiphong. He's Australian, works in mining. My coworker is dating an American consultant. He makes really good money, takes her traveling every month. My cousin's husband is British. He owns 3 businesses, just bought her a new car. She never said it directly, never said, "You're not doing enough," or "You should be more like them." But the message was clear. The comparison was constant, and always implicit was the phrase she used less now, but that hung between us anyway, "On tai jiayu," the category I'd been placed in. The category I was now failing to properly inhabit. I found myself scrambling, trying to prove I was still worth her time, still valuable, still properly on tai jiayu, despite the pay cut. When she mentioned her motorbike needed maintenance, I offered money even though I shouldn't have. She accepted without the warmth from before. Just a thank you, clinical, transactional. When she mentioned wanting to try an expensive restaurant, I made a reservation even though it would blow my weekly budget. She seemed pleased but distant, like I was performing adequately but without enthusiasm. My Swedish friends tried to talk to me. Lars sat me down at our regular bar and said, "Man, you need to walk away. This is textbook. She's losing interest because you're not as profitable anymore." I got defensive, said he didn't understand, that Shung was just stressed, that relationships have rough patches. He looked at me with pity and said, "How much have you given her total?" Actually added up. I did the math that night, sitting in my apartment, going through bank statements, adding up every transfer. 130 million dong, about $5,200, in 6 months. My savings were depleted. My credit card had a balance I'd never carried before. And for what? A relationship that was dissolving the moment my income dropped. Hong disappeared for 5 days in mid-October. Just completely vanished. No warning, no explanation. Didn't answer calls or texts. I was past worried by then, past making excuses for her. I was angry, hurt, and finally, allowing myself to see what had been obvious from the beginning. When she finally texted, it was brief. "Sorry, family emergency in the countryside, phone problems. I'll explain when I see you." The same excuse she'd used before, the same vague story. I didn't respond immediately. Let it sit for a few hours while I decided what I actually wanted to do. She showed up at my apartment that evening unannounced. Let herself in with the key I'd given her months ago. She was dressed nicely, makeup done, smiling like nothing was wrong. Started to explain about her aunt being sick, about her phone dying, about the countryside having bad reception. All of it delivered smoothly, practiced, like a script she'd performed before. I asked her to show me photos from the trip. She said she hadn't taken any, was too worried about her aunt. I asked for her aunt's name, the hospital she was at. She got defensive, said I was being weird, being controlling. Her phone buzzed on my kitchen counter, and the screen lit up with a message in Vietnamese. A man's name I didn't recognize, something about dinner tomorrow night. I asked who it was. She snatched the phone away, said it was her cousin, but her face had changed, hardened. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I could see her calculating, deciding how to play this, whether to keep up the act or let it drop. I said I knew she was lying, about the trip, about the phone, about everything. She laughed, but it sounded wrong. Nervous. Said I was being paranoid, acting crazy. Then her expression shifted, and she said, "You've changed since the money got tight. You're not the same generous person I met. You're becoming stingy." The word hit me like a slap. Stingy. After $5,200 in 6 months. After depleting my savings to help with every invented emergency. I asked her to leave. She looked shocked, like she couldn't believe I was actually pushing back. She said, "So that's it? You're just giving up on us?" I told her there was no us. There never had been. Just me being on tai jiayu and her extracting everything she could until the well ran dry. She got angry then. Really angry. Said I was just like all the other foreign men who came to Vietnam and thought every woman was a scammer. That I never really loved her. That I was always looking for an excuse to leave. The projection was stunning, but I was too tired to argue. I asked for my key back. She threw it at me, literally threw it across the room, and stormed out. I heard her motorbike start outside, and then the sound faded into the Hanoi night. I sat in my apartment feeling empty. Not sad exactly, not heartbroken the way I thought I'd be, just hollow, exhausted, and underneath it all, humiliated. Because I'd known from the beginning, and I'd chosen to ignore it. Chosen the fantasy over the reality. chosen being wanted, even in this shallow transactional way, over being alone. But I wasn't ready to let it go completely. Part of me still needed proof, needed to see with my own eyes that I'd been played. So the next evening, I did something I'm not proud of. I went to the address she'd given me months ago when I'd asked where she lived. The address in Haibatrong she'd said was her apartment, the place she'd never let me visit. I took a taxi, asked the driver to wait, walked up to the building expecting an apartment complex. Instead, I found myself standing in front of a massage parlor. Not even a subtle one. Pink neon signs. Girls sitting outside in short dresses, smoking cigarettes, calling out to passing men. Music thumping from inside. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the last piece of the fantasy crumble into dust. Then I walked up to the entrance. An older woman was sitting on a stool by the door, the mama-san, watching me with an expression that said she'd seen this exact scene play out 100 times before. I asked for Hing, used her full name. The woman's face shifted to something that looked like pity. She said, in English, "Shung not working tonight. She working tomorrow, maybe. You want different girl?" The casual way she said it, like this was routine. Like foreign men showed up asking for Shung all the time. I asked how long had worked there. The woman shrugged. Long time. Maybe 3 year. She very popular with foreign customer. You want to leave message for her? I said no. Walked back to the taxi. Gave the driver my address. Sat in the back seat watching the city blur past and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, something else. The illusion breaking. The fantasy shattering. The careful story I'd been telling myself, finally collapsing under the weight of reality. Everything made sense now. The disappearances that lined up with weekend nights. The constant need for money to support a family that may or may not have existed. The way she'd never let me into her real life. The practiced stories and rehearsed emotions. The phrase she'd used from the very beginning, "Ong Tai Jiwo." Rich foreigner. Not a compliment, not affection. Just a category. A type. A customer. I'd wanted so badly to believe I was different, that what we had was real, that she saw me, Eric, the person, not just the wallet. But I'd never been Eric to her. I'd just been Ong Taijio. Another foreign man with money and loneliness and a desperate need to feel wanted. And she'd identified that need the moment we met and exploited it perfectly. Back in my apartment, I blocked her number. Blocked her on Facebook, on Zalo, on everything. Didn't confront her, didn't ask for my money back. What would be the point? She'd just tell another story, and I'd already proven I was willing to believe anything if it meant avoiding the truth. I sat on my balcony and watched Hanoi's perpetual traffic and thought about all the times she'd called me Ong Tai, Giàu. All the times she'd said it with that smile, that laugh, that little touch on my arm. I'd thought it was playful. Thought it was her way of acknowledging our differences while accepting me anyway. Thought wrong about everything. The phrase wasn't a compliment. It was never a compliment. It was a warning label, and I'd worn it proudly. It was a job description, and I'd performed it eagerly. It was a category that reduced me to my wallet and my foreignness, and I'd accepted it as close enough to love, because I was too lonely and desperate to demand better. Lars called the next day, asked if I was okay, said he'd heard from other expats that Hyung worked at a massage parlor near Hai Ba Trung, said he was sorry I had to find out this way. I told him I already knew. Told him I'd gone there myself. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "How much did you lose?" $5,200, 6 months of my life. And whatever dignity I'd had left after my divorce. I'd come to Vietnam to feel alive again, and instead, I just found a different way to feel empty. The lesson isn't complicated. When someone defines you by what you have instead of who you are, walk away. When someone calls you rich foreigner, like it's your name, understand what they're actually saying. When you find yourself being categorized instead of known, being needed instead of wanted, being used instead of loved, have the courage to see it. But more than that, know yourself well enough to recognize when you're accepting scraps because you're starving, when you're tolerating disrespect because loneliness feels worse, when you're paying for companionship and calling it love because admitting the truth would destroy you. I didn't ignore the red flags because I was stupid. I ignored them because I was desperate. Because Ong Tai Zhao felt better than invisible. Because being wanted for my money felt better than not being wanted at all. Because the fantasy of love, even obviously fake love, felt better than the reality of being alone in a foreign city running from a failed marriage. That's the real trap. not the girl or the money or the lies. The trap is your own emptiness being so profound that you'll accept anything that pretends to fill it. Even when you know it's destroying you, even when every part of you is screaming the truth, you'll choose the beautiful lie because facing the ugly truth means facing yourself. I'm still in Hanoi, still in the same apartment. But I hear Ông Tai Giàu everywhere now, in bars where girls approach foreign men, in cafes where relationships are being negotiated, on street corners where the whole ecosystem of loneliness and exploitation plays out every single night. And every time I hear it, I remember how good it felt when Hing first said it, how much like a compliment it sounded, how easily I convinced myself it meant something it never meant. She called me Ông Tai Giàu, and I thought it meant she saw me. But really, she was just naming what I was worth to her. And I paid the price for mistaking being categorized for being known, for mistaking being needed for being loved, for mistaking a transaction for a relationship. The phrase means rich foreigner, but what it really means is mark, target, customer. And I wore that label like a badge of honor until there was nothing left to take.